Caterpillar is still the world's largest construction equipment maker by revenue. Roughly $37.8 billion in construction sales in 2024, about 16% of the global market. Number one on the planet by money collected. Hold on to that number, because the people who run that company will hold on to it too. The way a man holds the railing on a staircase, he is already falling down. The name that built the modern world, the Yellow Iron, the company whose tracks are pressed into the dirt of every continent. And then there is Sany. A Chinese firm few in this audience could have named 15 years ago, which has been the largest excavator manufacturer on Earth by unit volume since 2020, according to Off-Highway Research. Not by revenue, by machines, by the actual number of excavators leaving the gate and going to work on real job sites. Caterpillar remains the global revenue leader. But in units, and in segment after segment, the story is very different, and it has been getting different for a long time. The fatal decisions were made in boardrooms by executives trained to manage a balance sheet rather than build a machine. And we are watching the slow arithmetic of those decisions play out right now in the excavator market, which happens to be the single largest category in this entire industry. The interesting part is not that China is winning. The interesting part is who left the door open. If this is your first time here, subscribe. We document the corporate decisions inside the boardrooms that hollowed out one of the most respected industrial brands of the 20th century and the forces finishing the job now. The data tells the story, and the data is not kind to Peoria or to Irving, Texas, wherever the headquarters happens to be sitting this decade. We will get to that move and what it tells you in a moment. To understand what is happening to Caterpillar, you have to remember what Caterpillar used to be. Go back to the post-war decades. A Caterpillar machine was not just the best option, it was the reference standard against which every other machine on the planet was measured. The D9 dozer, the big track-type tractors, the wheel loaders, the motor graders that built the interstate highway system, and the dams and the airports. When a contractor in Germany, or Sweden, or Japan wanted to know how good their own equipment was, they compared it to Caterpillar. The yellow paint meant something. It meant uptime, resale value, and a dealer who would have your part on a truck before sundown. For a long stretch of the 20th century, Caterpillar was simply the ceiling. Nobody was above it. That dominance was not an accident, and it was not only marketing, it was paid for. For decades, Caterpillar plowed enormous sums into metallurgy, into undercarriage durability, into the boring, expensive, unglamorous engineering that lets a machine survive 20,000 hours in a quarry and still hold resale value. The dealer network was built the same way, one branch at a time, over generations. That is the kind of moat that takes 100 years to build, and the executives who inherited it seem to have assumed it would last another 100 years for free. Moats do not work that way. A moat is just a hole in the ground if you stop paying to keep it full. And then the company started managing itself like a financial asset instead of an engineering company. This is the part that matters. And it is the part the audience here understands better than any analyst on Wall Street, because you have run the machines. Somewhere in the late 20th century, the logic inside Caterpillar shifted. The men who rose to the top were increasingly trained in the Harvard Business School tradition. The MBA gospel of return on invested capital, margin discipline, and shareholder value above all. None of that is evil on its own. The problem is what it does to a company that builds heavy iron, where the payoff for real engineering investment can take 15 or 20 years to show up in the field. When every decision is run through the filter of next quarter's earnings and the stock price, research and development becomes a cost to be controlled rather than the lifeblood of the business. Caution wins every internal argument. The bold engineering bet, the expensive new hydraulics platform, the gamble on electrification, those get trimmed, deferred, value engineered into something cheaper. And the competitors notice. Here is where Europe walked through the open door first. Through the 1990s and the 2000s, while Caterpillar was optimizing margins and protecting its parts and dealer revenue, the European builders went after the premium segments one at a time. Liebherr, the German and Swiss family-owned giant, pushed hard into mining-class equipment and into hydraulics so advanced that Caterpillar found itself playing catch-up on its own home turf. Volvo Construction Equipment, built partly on the bones of acquisitions, took the premium wheel loader and articulated hauler segments and made them their own, with cab comfort and fuel efficiency that operators genuinely preferred. JCB, out of Britain, owned the backhoe loader and pushed into telehandlers. These were not budget brands, undercutting Caterpillar on price. They beat Caterpillar at the top of the market, on engineering, on the exact ground Caterpillar used to own outright. Mining, electrification, advanced hydraulics, premium loaders, all of it drifted toward Europe, while the people in Peoria counted the margin on replacement parts. It is worth pausing on how those European firms were structured, because the contrast is the whole lesson. Liebherr was family-owned, and a family that owns its own company can think in decades, can pour a fortune into a new mining excavator platform, and wait 15 years for it to pay off, because there is no quarterly call demanding to know why the margin dipped. None of those builders were run by men whose bonus depended on the next earnings report. So when the expensive bet came up, the patient owner said yes, and the public company managed for margin said no. Caterpillar did not lose the premium in a battle. It lost it in 1,000 budget meetings, where the engineering bet was the thing that got cut. That was the first wave. Europe took the premium. It was a slow, polite, profitable theft. And Caterpillar let it happen because defending those segments would have meant spending money that the shareholder-first logic did not want to spend. The premium got peeled off the top. But the premium is not the volume. The volume, the enormous base of the market, the millions of standard excavators doing standard work on standard job sites all over the world, that was still up for grabs. And that is the part China came for. Sany was founded in the late 1980s in Hunan province, making welding materials. For most of its early life, it was nothing that would have worried anyone in Illinois. XCMG traces its roots back even further, a state-linked industrial concern out of Suzhou. For decades, these were domestic Chinese players, building for a domestic Chinese construction boom of a scale the West has never seen. And that boom was the training ground. When you build hundreds of thousands of machines for the most demanding, most cost-sensitive, fastest-moving construction market in human history, you learn things. You learn how to build cheaply without building garbage. You learn how to iterate fast. You learn supply chains that no Western firm can match on cost. And eventually, you stop being a domestic player. It is hard to overstate the scale of that training ground. For roughly 2 decades, China poured more concrete and moved more dirt than the rest of the planet combined, building cities from nothing, laying tens of thousands of miles of highway and high-speed rail at a tempo no economy in history had ever sustained. Every one of those projects needed excavators, loaders, cranes, and concrete pumps, and it needed them cheap, and it needed them now. A Western firm refines a single new model over a careful 5-year cycle. A Chinese firm in that boom iterated across thousands of machines a year, learning in real time what failed in the field and fixing it on the next batch. Volume is not just an output. Volume is a teacher. The firms that survived that furnace came out knowing how to build a competent machine at a cost structure the rest of the world simply could not match. And XCMG deserves its own moment, because it is the one almost no one outside the industry can pronounce, and yet it is one of the largest construction equipment companies on the planet. Out of Suzhou, state-linked, enormous, XCMG builds across nearly the entire category. Cranes, loaders, excavators, road machinery, the full line. It is not a niche player, and not a knockoff shop. It is a full-spectrum industrial giant that, alongside Sany, sits among the very largest equipment makers in the world by revenue. And it got there the same way Sany did, by mastering volume at home and then turning outward. Because turning outward is exactly what happened next. Once the domestic boom had taught these firms to build at scale and at cost, they followed the same roads China's money was already building. Into Africa, where Chinese-financed infrastructure projects meant Chinese machines on the job site as a matter of course, and where a contractor on thin margins cared a great deal that the excavator cost meaningfully less and arrived faster. Into Southeast Asia, the same logic. Booming construction and a buyer who runs the numbers without sentiment. Into the Middle East, into the giant earth-moving programs across the Gulf. And then, the part that should genuinely worry Irving, increasingly into Europe itself, onto job sites in the heartland of the premium builders, where the old assumption that a serious contractor would never run Chinese iron is quietly being tested and quietly failing. The export push is not a rumor. It is iron showing up on more continents every year. In 2020, Sany became the largest excavator manufacturer in the world by unit volume, and it has held that position since. Say that slowly, because it is the whole story in one sentence. The largest excavator maker on Earth, by the count of actual machines, is a Chinese company. Not Caterpillar, not Komatsu, not any European builder. Excavators are the heart of this industry, the single biggest construction equipment category by volume, and the company that now ships more of them than anyone else is one few in this audience could have named 2 decades ago. That is not a forecast. That has been the reality on the ground since 2020. And the volume win is only half of it, because the Chinese firms did something else that should have set off every alarm in Peoria. They bought the crown jewels. In 2012, Sany acquired Putzmeister, the German concrete pump manufacturer that was, for generations, the absolute global icon of concrete pumping. Putzmeister pumps poured the foundations of skyscrapers and pumped concrete to the top of the Burj Khalifa, a German engineering legend, and since 2012, it has been owned by Sany. That same year, 2012, XCMG acquired Schwing, the other great German concrete pump giant. Both of the German crown jewels of concrete pumping are now Chinese-owned and have been for well over a decade. Sany today is the world leader in concrete machinery, and it got there partly by buying the very company that used to define the category. The student bought the master and then kept the nameplate on the door. Look closely at the shape of the Putzmeister deal, because it is more revealing than the headline. Sany did not buy Putzmeister to strip it and shut it down. It bought the brand, the engineering knowledge, the German credibility, and it kept the name on the building, because the name was worth more standing than scrapped. In one transaction, a Chinese firm acquired generations of German engineering and a reputation it would otherwise have spent decades trying to earn. The apprentice stopped imitating the master and simply purchased him. Think about the pattern. Europe took the premium engineering segments from Caterpillar by out-engineering them at the top. China is taking the volume base by outproducing everyone at the bottom and the middle, and then climbing. Because the quality is climbing too. And that is the part the skeptics keep getting wrong. The old line was that a Chinese excavator was cheap iron that would fall apart in 2 seasons. That was a fair criticism 15 years ago. It is not a fair criticism now, and the contractors actually running these machines in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, increasingly in Europe itself, will tell you the gap has closed faster than anyone predicted. Price advantage, plus units, plus quality, that is good enough and getting better every year. That is the combination that takes a volume market. It is worth being concrete about why the quality gap closed, because the skeptics treat it as if it cannot have happened when the reasons are not mysterious. The Chinese firms stopped relying on weak, domestic components and started buying the same world-class subsystems everyone else buys. Hydraulics, electronics, engines. The high-precision parts that used to be the obvious weak point increasingly come from the same top-tier global suppliers that feed the Japanese and the Europeans, or from Chinese suppliers that climb the same learning curve. They hired engineering talent, opened research centers, and ran the field failure feedback loop at a volume no Western firm could match, because every machine that broke taught the next batch how not to break. A product that improves with every one of hundreds of thousands of units does not stay cheap iron for long. It quietly becomes competent iron at an unbeatable price, which is exactly the iron that wins a volume market. Where does that leave Caterpillar in 2026? Let us be precise about this, because precision is the whole point, and because half of you will fact-check this sentence the moment it lands. Caterpillar is still number 1 in the world by revenue, roughly $37.8 billion in construction equipment sales in 2024, around 16% of the global market, still the single largest construction equipment company on the planet, measured by money. Sany, by revenue, sits somewhere around 6th on the global table. So when someone tells you Caterpillar has been passed, that is not true on the revenue line, and you should not say it, because it hands the skeptics an easy win. It is still the biggest, by the measure that Wall Street cares about most. But revenue is a rearview mirror. Revenue is the money you collected on machines and parts and service contracts sold off the strength of decisions made years ago, off a brand built over a century, off a dealer network, and an installed base that takes decades to erode. Units are the front windshield. Units are what is being chosen, right now, on real job sites, by real buyers spending their own money. And on units, in the largest category in the industry, Caterpillar is not number 1. It has not been since 2020. The revenue lead is real, but it is the lagging indicator. The unit loss is the leading one. A company can be number one by revenue and already be losing the future at the same time. And that is exactly the position Caterpillar is in. Hold those two numbers side by side, because the relationship between them is the entire argument. Revenue is high, partly because Caterpillar still charges a premium and still collects a fat stream of parts and service money on every machine already in the field, and that installed base is colossal, decades deep. A fortune in maintenance contracts that keep paying out no matter what happens to new sales. That is why the revenue line can look healthy long after the unit line has turned against you. A buyer who chose Sany this year is a parts and service customer Caterpillar will never get to bill over the next decade, and a buyer who liked his Sany is a repeat buyer Caterpillar has lost for the life of his fleet. Units lost today are revenue that quietly fails to arrive tomorrow. The revenue lead is not a contradiction of the unit loss. It is the slow echo of unit wins Caterpillar booked years ago, and the echo fades. And notice that the company spent this same stretch moving its headquarters out of Peoria, Illinois, the town synonymous with Caterpillar for 100 years, to Chicago in 2017, and then to Irving, Texas in 2018. A company chasing tax efficiency and proximity to financial markets, while the actual contest over the actual product was being lost on the unit line in the largest category it competes in. The headquarters moved closer to the money and further from the dirt. That is the whole story in one relocation. If you have run a Sany or an XCMG excavator next to a Caterpillar, drop both models in the comments and tell me which one you would buy with your own money today. Be specific. The model, the hours, the job. Let us see how many of us watched this shift happen in real time, before any boardroom in Texas was willing to admit it out loud. Because the people who run the machines always know before the people who run the spreadsheets. Here is the uncomfortable symmetry of the whole thing. Caterpillar did not lose to a single rival in a single dramatic battle. It lost slowly, on two fronts, to two different forces, for the same underlying reason. The premium went to Europe because Caterpillar would not spend what it took to defend the top. The volume is going to China, because Caterpillar built its model on premium pricing and parts revenue and dealer lock-in, and left the enormous price-sensitive base of the market wide open for a Sany or an XCMG that had spent 20 years learning to build at scale. Europe took the top. China is taking the bottom and the middle and climbing toward the top. Caterpillar is the corpse in the middle, still warm, still collecting the largest revenue check in the industry, still telling itself that being number one by money means it is number one. It does not. The European builders who quietly took the premium segments off Caterpillar across the 1990s and the 2000s understood something the boardroom never wanted to hear, that the standard is not a permanent possession, it is a thing you have to keep paying to defend. And the moment you start managing it as a financial asset instead of an engineering one, somebody who actually wants it will come and take it. Europe came for the premium. China came for the volume. And the only real question left is whether anyone can hold the volume base against Chinese units once price, scale, and improving quality all point the same direction, or whether Caterpillar's revenue lead is simply the slow, comfortable, lagging part of the exact same decline that already cost it the top of the market. The operators and engineers who watched Europe walk through the open door already know which way that question resolves. They watched it happen once, they're watching it happen again. The operators who saw it coming already know. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.